So my name is Rachel Casturi. I'm an Equitable Learning Facilitator, and I'm here today with Shelly Odawan and Noam Pellick, and we're going to talk to you about Equitable Learning Plans. And before I get going, I just want to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders folks who may be joining us today, and also acknowledge that I'm presenting from Bejugal land as well. If you could also please join the QR code, because we will try to make today's session interactive. So we've got a couple polls for you as we go, and also we'll have a group kind of role play exercise where you can either participate by just speaking out, or if you would like, you can, in the Menti, you can always put a written response. All right, so today we'll go over what is our service, what is Equitable Learning Services, and what are its foundations, what are your responsibilities as an educator, and then some tips for you around managing equitable learning plans and what needs to be done. Then we'll do our group role play, and then hopefully we'll have some time for more questions and answers. If not, if you have lingering questions, you can always email els@unsw.edu.au. Okay, first poll. So I'll just give you a minute or so to have a look. You know, equitable is in our name. So one thing that's important to think about in terms of defining our service is, what does that word equity actually mean? So I'll give you a second to respond. The majority got it. So what is equity? Providing different levels of support based on individual needs to achieve fair outcomes for everyone. So great work. We'll move into a background, just generally, what is ELS? So we are a federally mandated service meant to support students with disabilities. This is going to be students who have neurodivergent conditions like autism, ADHD, specific learning disability. We also support students with mental health conditions. So that could be bipolar disorder, anxiety. We support students with physical disabilities as well. So students who have scoliosis, students who are wheelchair users for different underlying reasons. We also are supporting students who are primary carers. So if you're a primary carer of someone with a disability or like a chronic health dimension, say you're the primary carer for a grandparent with dementia, could be one example. So we have some often mature age students who are in that situation. So we support these students to access higher education, because we know the research shows it's more difficult for these students. They have lower graduation rates and things like that. So the learning plan is meant to help them manage their studies more successfully and make sure that they can participate on the same basis as their peers. So our job is really to work with you to share that learning plan and then collaboratively work to make sure that those adjustments are implemented. Where an adjustment can't be implemented, then we want to work with you to workshop, are there any other existing alternatives that we can use to support the student? We want to make sure that we're legally compliant, since again, we're a federally mandated service. And we also want to support you to teach inclusively. So there are some ways, and we'll get into this later, where you can strive to sort of reduce the learning plan workload through making sure that you're already teaching inclusively. And we'll give you some ideas about how you can do that later on. So again, what we want to help you do is make sure the learning outcomes are met within your course, that the students feel satisfied about their experiences in your course, regardless of their background, and also really to support and uphold and promote justice, because that's what is at the heart of our service. Okay, so I'll do a brief poll, and I just want you to, on a scale here, rate yourself on the following statements in terms of how much you agree or disagree in your understanding. So I'll give you maybe a minute or two to do that. I think for the sake of time, we'll just move forward, and I'm going to hand it over to Shelly, who is going to walk you through those responsibilities.
Thank you, Rachel, and thanks for the tech lesson, because I will inevitably muck up this PowerPoint. So apologies in advance. So I'm just going to talk about some of the key concepts around equitable learning plans and reasonable adjustments very briefly, and just touch a little bit on the legislation while doing that. I think the poll kind of demonstrated that generally everybody has a firm understanding about the reasons why we would implement a reasonable adjustment for students, but what is sometimes a little bit less advanced is our understanding of what a reasonable adjustment is and how they're developed. So a reasonable adjustment is any modification to an existing practice that is sort of by definition discriminatory towards a student with a disability. It is a process of balance. So when we are determining the reasonableness of an adjustment, we are looking at the student's wishes, the impact of their condition, the impact or the effect of the adjustment on the student, on you as the convener or other administrators within the university, on other students, and then also central to that is the effect of the adjustment on the academic rigour and integrity of the course or the program in general. Cost of the adjustment comes into it, but very, very much as an afterthought. The reasons why we do this, obviously our obligations, as Rachel mentioned, it is enshrined within federal anti-discrimination legislation and state-based legislation. It is primarily the disability standards for education that we look to give us a really clear understanding of the university's obligations. And for all of us within the university, it's important to remember that there is that vicarious liability there. That does exist, and I'm sure Noam, who will present later on, might be able to elaborate a little bit on that for you all. I'm going to push the button now, so wish me luck. How we go about creating ELPs. So that was a round of applause for everyone online from the people that are in the room. How we go about creating ELPs, it is an opt-in process. That is the very first fact around the registration process. It's really important to understand a student with a disability does not ever need to register with ELS if they do not wish to do so, and we cannot compel them to do so. That does not necessarily negate our obligation to provide an equitable learning experience for that student. So if there are ways in which we need to accommodate their needs, then we must do so regardless. Administratively, obviously, it is much easier if we guide them through the ELS processes. So a student has to present to ELS with some medical documentation which sort of outlines their diagnosis and the extent to which it impacts on their capacity to engage in their studies here. We then ask the student to come and attend a comprehensive interview with one of our equitable learning facilitators. And I think it's important to also highlight for everybody that our equitable learning services team is a really it's a strong team and it's a multidisciplinary team. So there is somebody within our team that can touch on almost every facet of impairment from their professional background. So once we determine with the student what reasonable adjustments may be required, sometimes we will communicate and negotiate and collaborate with schools, usually with your academic disability advisor or program authority, course conveners. That does occur in some instances before we develop the equitable learning plan. And that's usually in cases where we may have some concerns around the inherent requirements and the student's capacity to meet those with or without the equitable learning plan and adjustments. We'll then email that once it's developed to the student and to yourselves as conveners. And then this is where we effectively hand over a large part of the responsibility to you, because the responsibility to implement a range of those adjustments in the equitable learning plan sits with you. And I think this is the point where I would emphasize that a reasonable adjustment that is documented and prescribed within a student's equitable learning plan is a mandatory adjustment to our practices. It is compulsory. It is less a recommendation. It is something that we expect will be implemented. Although we do acknowledge that there are situations where that can be a little bit difficult to do, we will work with you and your ADAs will work with you to consider an appropriate alternative. I've already done it. There we go. Some very fast facts about the ELP. It does not contain personal health information about the student. It is up to the student how much information they wish to disclose to you, and we make that very clear to students. I acknowledge that there are times where it would be useful for you to have some of that information to give context to what you're being asked to do, and certainly in relation to modifications of some teaching practices for students with sensory impairment, for example. That's really useful information to have, but we allow the student agency in how that information and what of that information is shared. So we do encourage some limited disclosure at times where it is relevant. They are created comprehensively. We don't want to put a student in a position where they're having to renegotiate their equitable learning plan for each course every single term. It is an administrative process, this development of this document. And so we try to ensure that it caters for every scenario the student may encounter while they're studying here, which is, of course, why some of you will have had situations where you look at the ELP and you think none of this is relevant to my course. They are not static documents. We update them as often as we need to, and generally that is guided by the student. Changes to their course, changes to their program, exacerbations of their health condition, new diagnosis, all of those reasons will come into play there. There's no rigid rules for determining what is a reasonable adjustment, and that's because it is so specific to the individual student. We are not looking at it based on the diagnosis. We are looking at it based on the extent to which that diagnosis impacts that student. An adjustment is unreasonable. So the adjustments within the ELP may be unreasonable for a number of different reasons. But the primary one that we talk about and that's talked about within the legislation is in relation to unjustifiable hardship to the institution or harm. There are rarely situations where that is a reasonable argument to decline an adjustment. In my experience, I've seen that maybe a couple of times in 2 decades. This is what an ELP looks like if you have not seen one before. We have the student details. You can see it's very, very limited to their name, their preferred name, and their ID. We've got a bit of a purpose statement. We then categorise the adjustments. So we're looking at things like assignments, and then you'll see that's the black bold. And then in the blue, we have got the actual adjustment. You do need to read through that entire blue text because you will see things like where we have the time extensions, so extensions on assignments. It's not till the back end of that you can see that it is a 1-week provision. And then underneath that, there's a bit of an explanation around the adjustment itself. That does tend to tell you and the student what your obligations are in relation to implementing that. We email these at the start of term. We also ask that students do that. The reason we ask that students do that is so that they can open that conversation with you. If the student does not send you their ELP, that does not mean you do not need to implement the ELP because we have already provided it to you. We send it out through the course contacts that are listed in the term planning. We don't have access to modify that. So we do often at the beginning of term get a lot of responses from conveners saying that, that I taught that last year, I'm not teaching that this year. That is a matter for the school. You do need to let the school know so that they can update that. And we have had a lot of feedback around some of the sort of efficiency or inefficiency that can be created by the sheer volume of ELPs that get sent out at the beginning of term. And it's a live issue. We're well aware of it. And we will keep working with the team that run that system that we use, the database we use to identify a more streamlined process for you. But in the meantime, just know that we hear you on that. Implementing the ELP. So one of the things that we've noticed that some conveners are doing, and we really support this, is to send an email to students outlining their understanding of the students' ELP requirements. We've got a template that we've created that we will send out with these slides to you after the training in the next few days, and you're welcome to use that or modify that. But we definitely encourage that as a standard practice, because it does give you and the student the opportunity then to have that conversation. The student may then at that point choose to disclose more to you and to give you that context that you might need. When you receive an equitable learning plan and you look at the adjustments and you immediately see something and you think, no, I can't implement that adjustment, that's not a full stop at the end of that sentence. It's, no, I can't implement the adjustment as it's outlined within the Equitable Learning Plan. So what I will do first is speak to my academic disability advisor about other ways that they may suggest I can accommodate the student's needs in my course. There will be a link here. If you're not sure who your academic disability advisor is, we'll put that up for you. Some of the responsibility for a student's reasonable adjustment sits with you. Some does sit with us. So this table here just talks you through the things that we understand are your responsibility, the things that are ours. So we're looking at some of those accessibility requirements, so provision of software and things like that. The enabling supports, so participation assistance, lab assistance that we may hire for a student, general administration things like early class registration, access to assistive technology centre in the library, that sort of thing. And then obviously it's the academic specific adjustments around extensions, exams, inclusive teaching practice that sits within your scope. The higher degree research and work integrated learning is a much more complex area, and it does require a lot more negotiation and collaboration between us, the student, and yourselves, and then also sometimes external supervisors. So that one is a more complicated process, and we have recently developed a new work integrated learning ELP, which sits separate to the student standard ELP, and some of you may start to see that. And we're indeed doing a similar thing with higher degree research. Some common reasonable adjustments in courses that you may see. Things that are automatically applied and to be negotiated. So one of the things that we do see sometimes is, obviously our expectation, I'll reframe that, our expectation in relation to the ELP and your obligations is that you will automatically apply assignment extensions as they're prescribed, lab report extensions, alternative formatting, some of those inclusive teaching practices like allowing audio recording for students, repeating questions, providing the teaching materials, course materials in advance, those sorts of things. Consideration around breaks or absence during class, attendance considerations, that sort of thing. But there are some things that need to be negotiated, and this really is a mutual obligation process. It relies on you and the student engaging in it both together. So that is around class participation, class presentations, alternative assessments, alternatives to exams, regular submissions, group work alternatives, those sorts of things. And again, I'd reiterate, and I'm sure Noam will be able to touch on this too, is that is an area where your ADA can really assist you. Tips on reducing your workload. I feel like I'm going to hand back over to Rachel for this one.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so tips for reducing workload. So I'll just give some tips from my perspective, and then we'll have Noam join us, and he can tell you how he does it and his role. So to save time reading individual ELPs, especially in really large courses, there's a couple strategies you can implement. So one is just to make sure you're teaching inclusively. And I'll show you a slide in a second to help you understand what I mean by that. But going down to the other bullet, you can download an Excel report of all students and adjustments in your courses. So it would help give you a really quick overview of the adjustments within your courses. And then you can sort of filter that spreadsheet out to things that are actually relevant to the course, delete things that you definitely know are not needed, like not necessary within your course because it just doesn't apply or make sense at all for any student. And it's just a way to help you filter and get that broad overview. So there is a video that we have that you'll have access to when you get these slides after the presentation that shows you the process of downloading that Excel report from the ELS staff portal. In terms of implementing inclusive teaching strategies that might help reduce ELP workload, it's not a guarantee because it's always case by case with particular students and why they may have a particular adjustment, but there are some things you can really easily knock out in terms of looking at the learning plan more broadly. So if you're seeing adjustments around transcripts or audio recording, well, if you're already using Echo 360 to record all of your lectures, you don't need to address those adjustments for that student. Other examples may be things like we might ask you to provide teaching materials or to turn on automated captions or subtitles if you're teaching online. There are adjustments around that. But if you're just already doing that as part of best practice, then again, you can filter out, kind of delete those adjustments for the most part because, it applies as well. Things like, some students use absence during class to manage their conditions. They may just need to step out, take a break. If you've got scheduled breaks during class already, they might just be able to use that time with everyone in the class to step out, but there may be cases where that might not be their specific situation. So that's why it says adjustments may not be needed. It's not guaranteed that just because you implement an inclusive teaching strategy that it will actually address the underlying need. But for the most part, I think I would say the majority of learning plans, there's a good chance that implementing a lot of these inclusive teaching strategies will get you in that direction and reduce workload. So I'm now going to hand it over to Noam, who joins us from the Faculty of Law, where he is our academic disability advisor and works very closely with Shelley, to give some tips and advice in his perspective on his role with us and the work of implementing reasonable adjustments.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Shelley. Hi, everyone. So what I will try to do is to share with you how things look from my end. My end is an academic, someone who teaches and runs his own courses, and someone who touches base with Shelley and the team and with colleagues as part of my role as the faculty ADA. So I've been doing it for a year and a half, being the faculty ADA as part of the overall EDI portfolio. And I think there are some ways in which we will manage to improve students' experience and reduce our colleagues' workload and colleagues' anxiety with respect to ELP. I think those are two related but separate issues that we might want to address. So the Sunday before all week, your inbox is flooded with ELS. not very EDI friendly, but that's a different story. And then you need to start sweeping through the ELS and see what is relevant for your course and what is not relevant for your course. Some of us might have 10 students with adjustment in our classroom. Some of us might have hundreds of students with adjustment in our classrooms. So the Excel sheet that Rachel just mentioned is really helpful, but it's only part of the story, because this document includes an overview of your students and their adjustments. And in our case, in the Faculty of Law and Justice, we have a professional staff that helps conveners download these Excel sheets, provide them to colleagues, divide students into the tutorial groups, and so on and so forth. So that reduces some of the workload that academics used to do, but still requires us to look at the adjustment themselves and see what is relevant to our courses and what is not relevant. And it is something that is our responsibility as academic, and help from professional colleagues is limited. They are not in the classroom, they don't know the teaching practices, they don't know what the inherent requirements necessarily for each course and each program are. So we need to have an eye on those Excel sheets and see how we can implement some of the adjustment, those that require some negotiation or some in-class adjustment to our teaching practices. Adjustment that speaks to time extensions, either centrally managed exams or others. It's easier to handle. Your teaching support team can also help you with modify submission deadlines on Moodle, it or not, and use their help as well. They are much more, they are quicker in doing these Moodle notifications, in creating separate spaces for different cohort of students if needs be, which are only accessible and available to students with adjustments. So you can ask their help. And I'm sure that your professional colleagues will help you set up those different zones on Moodle, reducing the workload that comes with that. But the main issue is about those adjustments that are either unique, that you didn't encounter before, or those that you struggle to implement in your classroom, that you really don't know what to do and how to approach the student. So my suggestion will be to first go to your ADA rather than to go straight to this blank inbox of the ELF services, for a number of reasons. The first one will be that if you have questions as to how one adjustment should be implemented, you can rest assured that probably a colleague that taught this student at the previous term had the same issue, and they already had this discussion either with your ADA rep or with ELS. So going to your ADA rep will use this institutional memory and institutional practices. It will save time for everyone. It will ensure some consistency with the program. It ensures some consistency for the students' experience in the classroom, and it will make things much easier for everyone in implementing an adjustment in your classroom. If this student is unknown to your ADA, or whether this may be that they have a new adjustment in their ELP, so this is an opportunity to have a discussion with someone who has I won't say seen it all, but might see more than what you have seen in terms of adjustment and how they work in the classroom. A colleague who knows the teaching practices for every program that might have taught this course with you before or not, it doesn't matter, but can have this conversation about how implementation might look like, considering the pedagogical needs of the class, the assessment, the inherent requirements for the course and the program, the learning outcomes that we need to bear in mind when we design our assessment, when we design our coursework, and have a conversation of how it can work. In my experience, it goes a long way, and usually most issues are being resolved at this stage, where we can come up with a plan of how to implement an adjustment in a specific course. If we can't, because we are still struggling as to what would be the best course of action, then there are two ways to continue from there. A, we can schedule a meeting with the student themselves, and usually a conversation with the student goes a long way. It doesn't always work with all students and with all adjustments. Some students feel under pressure. Some students feel that this conversation can be intimidating, or maybe they are coerced to share some of the conditions that they might have, and they may not be willing to do so. But constructive conversations where you can discuss the nature of the course and the teaching practices or the logics behind certain assessment, and then discuss with the student how they envision that their adjustment will work with this particular course. You can come with a solution that both you and the student can live with and serve the student's needs. And if the conversation is not helpful or if a student is reluctant to have it, then we go and speak with the academic learning facilitator and share our questions with them. And I think they're doing this job for a year and a half now. I think we always found a solution as to how to implement an adjustment, even in times where it was unclear for us or where there was the very few occasions where there was a tension, where there was a need that we need to that we were asked to address, and we just couldn't find a teaching practice that will serve this need. In our case, in the law faculty, it mainly speaks about class recording, which is an issue that we are trying to resolve these days, but it's still a living issue for us. The students that need this recording and need the transcripts are not necessarily being served, and we find ways around it with teaching notes, with note-taking apps, and so on and so forth. So we managed to develop some ways to serve students' needs. And at the end of the day, I think this is what, and I'll maybe end with that so we can move on with the presentation. This is what should guide us in this space. That our job is to serve the students' needs and to make sure they are included in the classroom. And it's the job of the Equitable Learning facilitators. So we are not in any competition. We are not a mutually exclusive services at the faculty. We are supporting at the university. Sorry, we are supporting students from different perspectives. The ELP have their own role, and Shelley described what compliance mechanisms we are serving here. And our role is to deliver on these inclusive practices that we will ask to implement. And a conversation as to how it can happen in particular courses is very useful. It's very practical. We reach solutions. And our role as an academic, and I think I'll end with that, we are not in a position to question the adjustment. And I think we should make peace with that. Some colleagues are happy to push back, wanting to have some more information about the conditions that the student might have that led to the creation of this ELP. That's not our role. We are not in a place where we have the knowledge or the expertise to question the adjustment or to question the professional assessment of the academic learning facilitators. We can have a conversation about how adjustment can be implemented.
No, I'm kind of listening to this, but
or maybe
I'm going to go down at 1:30.
How the student needs can be best served. But that's part of the conversation that we can have. And then if you present what the issues are and why certain adjustment, for example, won't meet students' program learning requirements, then the Equitable Learning Facilitator will go and see whether other adjustment might be suitable in this condition. And for the third time, I'm saying I'm ending with that. Just recently, Shay and I worked on an issue where a student, without going into too many details, had adjustment around their class participation. They enrolled into a course that requires lots of role playing in the classroom. This was inherent to the course learning outcome. And there was just no way around it. The student refused to participate and to be vocally active in class, in a class that requires role playing in each and every class. It was a class about negotiation. And at the end of the day, our recommendation to the student was, you might want to withdraw from this class. It's maybe not the right space for you. Negotiation cannot be done in writing, but that required a lot of conversation with the course teacher, with the student, with the ELP. It's an exception to the rule, I think. I think that was the first time when we actually recommended students to consider withdrawing from the course because we couldn't find a way to accommodate their need in that course. But from the hundreds of conversations I think that we had over the last year and a half, that was the first time that was the conclusion that we came to. And I will end with that.
Thank you so much, Noam. So we'll move forward with the prezzo. So we've got, we're gonna poll you again now that we've had our little discussion of responsibilities. So if you can just reevaluate yourself, even though it seems like it was fairly strong to start with, but if you want to go ahead and re-poll, or if you joined late, now you'll have a chance to assess yourself. We will have a hopefully Q&A time at the end, where if you have some questions you can ask, or it's an opportunity if you have lingering questions to maybe meet up and have a conversation with your academic disability advisor. forward. So we're going to do, it's a group activity. You can participate by speaking up through your mic, or if you just want to, you'll be able to just type your responses into the Menti as well. So we want you to sort of take on the role of an equitable learning facilitator. So someone like Shelley or myself. And the situation presented to you is you've got a uni student with autism and Tourette syndrome. So this is John. He's 20 years old. He experiences both motor and verbal tics, which he can't control. You know, he's a highly motivated student, very passionate about his studies. And he's written into his initial registration with us that he tends to procrastinate and have difficulty making friends. So then you meet with John as his equitable learning facilitator. So you're going to interview him and you're going to create his learning plan. So you've got medical information, so some background information about John. You know, it says he's exceptionally bright. It also details things about how he can become easily overwhelmed, has poor executive functioning for his age, which is especially exacerbated in stressful situations. And he also then may experience uncontrolled verbal or motor tics that can make writing difficult or fine motor tasks challenging. So that is the overview of the student. And so our question to you would be to think about a course you convene or tutor in. What are some of the barriers that, based on that background information we've given you, John might experience within your course? So we do see that there were a few questions put in the Menti, which is great, and we'll get to those. We'll make sure to have 5 minutes reserved at the end. So this is looking great. We're identifying some barriers. So making connections might be difficult. If he's involved in peer assessment tasks, he could be disadvantaged. You know, class presentations or discussions. Any additional ones that we want to go from perspective, Shelley, or? We'll move forward in the interest of time, but great. So another question. So given these barriers that we've identified, what adjustments would you put on John's learning plan? So think about how could that class be modified to make sure that he has equal access to participate on the same basis as a peer who doesn't have this profile and who doesn't have a disability, right? So I do see in the Teams chat some inclusive teaching strategies. So group work, thank you, Carol. Group work being scaffolded, breaking down tasks into chunks, things that help the environment to start with a calm place. That's a really good one that I think is often can be overlooked, but just kind of creating that safe environment, and that can even mean the sensory environment for a student with a profile like John. So just, you know, maybe just dimmer lighting, whatever you feel like makes kind of a calmer atmosphere may be helpful, and making these students feel welcome as well. So we're thinking through lots of different scenarios, and remember, ELPs are created comprehensively. So we also, when we're sitting with John, have to think big in a sense about, you know, what he might encounter in a gen ed class or core class. Absolutely, potentially alternatives to in-class presentation if he feels like he needs that. It could just be that he wants a little more time in case, you know, a tic happens, or some flexibility. And of course, he doesn't want to get marked down for something he can't control. So if he does show or produce some verbal or motor tics during a presentation that make it seem off topic or make the paralinguistic nonverbal elements seem less than or different than what we would expect from a neurotypical person. It's thinking about your rubric in that sense. So how can you make sure that he's not marked down or disadvantaged for displaying those things? And it may also mean if he has any level of anxiety associated with his tics, we'd ask him about that. It may be that he's just more comfortable doing a pre-recording or something like that, or just presenting to you. So, it depends. Every student will be a little different. Just because they have a particular diagnosis does not warrant a specific adjustment. It's individualized to them and the impacts that they experience from their condition and how they move through the world. Online community, so different ways for him to participate, not basing everything around, say, group interaction or discussion in class, so that he has other avenues. With some students with group work, particularly if they're on the autism spectrum, I may work with them and the convener or the tutor to talk about particularly students who may have experienced bullying or victimization in relation to how they participate in groups, to provide more structure within the group, to support them to understand their role in the group, and then also to moderate any peer feedback that may be requested so that the convener has a look over it first before that's shown to the student, because sometimes our students, other students can be discriminatory in the way that they give feedback to students who present with conditions like these. We want to think through that. We also want to teach our students how we give good feedback, critical feedback as part of our teaching as well. So I might talk about a convener tutor with that. Laboratories, I'm glad people brought that up. So particularly because we've talked about John having some fine motor difficulties, we might ask him if he's in science or another class that's going to require like manipulation of chemicals or whatever it might be. How much support he needs with that, and what does it look like? Does it just mean he needs a little bit more time? Is that possible or not? Does it mean that he needs somebody with him in the class so that he can give verbal instructions to that can help him carry out the tasks if, say, he has some difficulty manipulating the instruments or the things that he needs to do? So these were all really good insights. We've got, I think, one more before we get to the Q&A. So just thinking, what are some difficulties or challenges for implementing these types of adjustments that we've talked about? And I know in the Q&A there is a question about like workload barrier, and I know that comes up a lot. So we will address that as best we can within the last few minutes, but let's think about other reasons it might be difficult to implement some of these adjustments in your class.
By process of elimination, I am the sacrificial lamb to address the gigantic elephant in the room, which is workload. Absolutely. I can completely understand why that is the biggest challenge that you would experience when you're attempting to have those adjustments implemented as the equitable learning facilitator, because that's what you're all role playing now, because that is our greatest challenge. How do we, as equitable learning facilitators, have a conversation with you about enforcing the students' support needs and rights with the workload elephant? And I acknowledge that it is difficult. What I would say is that that's a conversation for you to have with your ADA and then also with your supervisor within the school. If the workload issue is such that you feel that you are not able to provide the support that you need to all students in your course, I mean, if that was me, my first step would be to speak to my supervisor to talk about my workload. Is there an allocation, an additional allocation that could be provided for within your workload framework to accommodate your effectively your job requirements? If you are a casual academic, that is understandably a much more difficult conversation, but again, it's one that you do need to have, because our obligation to provide that support to a student is not negated because we say, rightly, that it is a workload issue. Some of the challenges, you've got that their workload. How can students still meet the learning outcomes of the course? That is absolutely a challenge that we face. on a regular occasion. But again, it is really that process of collaborating with each other and with the student to work out how do we allow the student an alternative way to demonstrate that they meet the learning outcomes. So they'll let you know, and I think it is a matter of thinking very creatively about that. And again, talking to the student is the expert in their life. They know what their capabilities are, what their capacity is, and they can give you some really good insight into other ways in which they can do things that you simply will not have without the benefit of their lived experience. Noam, this is probably a question for you.
So thank you, Carol, for your comment on the chat. Look, I'm not aware either, but it's not a conversation we should not have. And B, what we were able to do at law is to provide budget for support and for training. It didn't come easy. The budget is not huge, but it's there because we and our managers, head of schools, and they recognize that it's work that we need to carry. I mean, there is no way around it. It needs to be compensated and recognized in different ways. It depends on your workload model. It depends if you're a full-time academic and you have like a teaching credit system of some sort, or teaching a location that takes into account the number of students that you have, and then the numbers of labs or tutorials that you run. But sometimes there are top-ups that we need to account for, and it can come in the work that goes into putting together alternative assessments or putting together some time to meet with students. And if you are casual, then the new My Timesheet process should account for that. And the faculty and the university should find a way to pay for your time. So it's not a question of, I mean, there is no question that this work needs to be done. And again, that's I think the point of departure for this entire discussion. Implementation needs to be followed. And if it takes more time, and if it takes you out of your comfort zone and your time envelope, those are discussions that you need to have. And I think that in my experience, university is more open to hear those claims than it used to be. There are budgetary concerns, but there are also recognition that work needs to be compensated and recognized. So if it's not the case in your school or in your faculty, raise it with your ADA, raise it with your union, and have those discussions with your line manager. And I'm happy to meet with anyone that might have some question about it and how we went about it in law. It's not a perfect system. Colleagues will still feel that their work is under-recognized, but it's an improvement comparing to where we were a year ago or 2 years ago, or 5 years ago.
Thanks, Noam. So I think we're about there. So we've got some questions. Pretty well, we're at the end of the training. So if you need to go, I'll just quickly say, we will send the slides out to you after the training. We'll also send a handout out to you that's a little bit more detailed. Any questions we can't address quickly here, we would also follow up with an email with a response to those that everybody can see. Pathways for students who need adjustments but don't feel comfortable registering with ELS or Perfume. Okay, so neurodivergent students, I think that's going to be about teaching inclusively. Diversified is coming out with a neurodiversity toolkit that I'm not sure that it's available just yet, but you can Google UNSW Diversified. You could work on implementing the strategies within that toolkit in your class, so they may not even really need to register with ELS potentially. If they're not feeling comfortable registering, but maybe they've disclosed something to you, you can still work with them to try to meet whatever need it is they're sharing with you, as long as they're comfortable expressing that. If they don't want to pursue a formal diagnosis, they can still come to us. Don't let that, even if they're not diagnosed, don't let that stop them from saying you should still have a conversation with ELS about this. Even if they just go to their GP and express some of the symptoms to their GP that may align with neurodivergence, their GP can fill out our form on our website, speaking to those impacts, and then we will see the student and have further discussion with them. Yeah, we went over time, which is great. Feedback channel, ELS. ELS at unsw.edu.au. And then, is there a place we can go for examples of effective adjustments for different issues? Sorry, we're just having a little side conversation about the best place to direct you. But you can come, obviously you can go to the academic disability advisor, because the first stop will have experience probably already working around the particular adjustment you're thinking about. You can come to the Equitable Learning Facilitator for ideas. And also, Lucy has the inclusive teaching. If you want to put the link in the chat, Lucy, that would be great. You could look there for ideas as well. All right, I think that is it. So thanks for joining. Here are some links that will be useful to you in making sure these adjustments are implemented and upholding justice at UNSW, because as a reminder, that's what we're here to do. So thanks for your time.